Hi, I'm Olivia Berkman, and welcome to the Financial Executive Podcast. Financial Executives International was founded nearly a century ago as a community of like minded professionals focused on developing the role of the financial controller. Today, the profession is going through another accelerated transformation with the development of the ESG controller role that requires new skills and metrics to match against stakeholder demands that are rapidly changing. The Financial Education and Research Foundation, or FERF, is kicking off a series of conversations with ESG controllers and other thought leaders in the ESG finance space, focusing on how these leaders are adapting to the challenge. These conversations, along with a survey and other interviews, will ultimately result in a new research study on ESG controllers by FERF. In this first conversation, I spoke with Mastercard's ESG controller, Tarynn Zenk. Taryn leads the team responsible for reporting integrity over Mastercard's ESG disclosures and KPIs that measure progress towards the organization's ESG goals. Here's the conversation. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with your background. Just tell us how you find yourself in your current position at Mastercard in ESG controllership.
Well, I have 15 or over 15 years experience in both financial and non-financial reporting. And then I've been in this role, which is when it started, wasn't called ESG controller, but ESG controller since early 2022. And I'd also been involved in Mastercard's sustainability report, now our ESG report, since the initial report when we published in 2018. Although, of course, as you can imagine, since then, my involvement has expanded significantly. And then prior to taking this role, I held many roles within corporate controllership here at Mastercard, primarily focused on leading our SEC and financial reporting team. And then before that, I had over 10 years experience in public accounting. So I was at PwC and banking capital markets practices, both in New York and London, where I also focused on SEC reporting, financial reporting and compliance, internal controls, accounting policy, very standard assurance work there. And there's just so much scrutiny now around ESG data and disclosures and like the expectations from investors and stakeholders for that information to be as reliable with the same values and accountability as financial data and financial reporting that's existed for like so many decades. So I think Mastercard, really tackled this challenge a couple of years ago by creating this ESG controllership team and subsequently continuing to invest in ESG reporting capabilities, I'd say in a multitude of ways.
That's helpful. Thank you. And just kind of taking a step back, can you break down the difference really between what a traditional controller is responsible for and what an ESG controller focuses on?
Yeah, I mean, the core skills for an ESG controller are really consistent, I think, with the skills that are needed from a traditional controller, right? A successful ESG controller is going to be well-versed in data governance. They're going to have experience building internal data collection processes and controls for reporting and compliance. And they need to be self-starters, right? Taking initiatives and really finding like creative solutions to these new and emerging challenges in a very fast-paced environment. I think the experience for a traditional controller is a combination of like accounting, finance, controls, audit, risk management, or those kind of fields, and obviously, has a CPA or an equivalent. There's also that critical knowledge of regulatory compliance, and usually I'd say like US GAAP or like IFRS and SEC reporting, and then linked to that like SOX controls processes. And I think the real difference in an ESG controller is although they need lots of those skills, they also then, need to understand and have exposure to the ESG reporting standards and frameworks, the GRIs, the SASB, the TCFDs, and really understanding like the plethora of emerging regulations that are founded on those voluntary standards and frameworks. That space and that knowledge base isn't in the traditional controller background and skill set, maybe starting in the last couple of years and evolving.
So how did you bring yourself up to speed on these additional areas, the ESG related areas? What's that process? Because I'm gonna assume that these were not, part of your college curriculum
No.
and right. So how did you get there?
I, I think it started, like I mentioned, just through general, inquisitiveness of,
Right.
hey, there's this other thing over here. I know what my skill set is. I help at that point, write SEC filings. I've helped with proxy statements with have a regulatory space. I don't write it, but I know what, to look for when I'm thinking about like process and data governance and controls. And so that was a natural transition when we started doing our ESG reporting at Mastercard. How can controllership help? We have this huge report that I think at the time was 200 pages, and is there risk in what we're saying? Not that we're not being transparent, but how we're saying it, just bringing it into and embedding it into the whole concept of reporting by a company as a whole is really critical. And I think that's where controllership can help. And then I had to upskill. I did a lot of learning as you get into some of the topics, right? Whether that's talking to my peers internally or doing my own research classes, reading, all of the above. That I think anyone has to do on any job, right? But you leverage what you know and then you upskill yourself.
Right. So how is the ESG reporting process structured at Mastercard specifically?
Yeah, so we have two different offices. We have our sustainability office, and we obviously have the finance function and controllership team. So with the creation of the ESG controllership team a couple years ago, I think we more established there, and it's obviously grown in like the division of roles and responsibilities since we started. But we really established that finance and controllership, given all the background that I explained, it is the right lead for executing regulated disclosure requirements and compliance, right? I think primarily it was thought of with the SEC lens when we first started. Now it is very heavy with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And also providing global support because these regulations are not only in two jurisdictions, right? And then the sustainability function has ownership over our voluntary reporting, our rater and ranker responses, a lot of our communications strategies as they work with comms and marketing. And then, I'm sure this is similar for many other companies with ESG reporting. It's increasingly just as a generally being integrated into finance functions, right? Particularly as it comes to regulated reporting. And that need to really enhance transparency and accountability. And as I previously mentioned, like ESG controllers, their skills and backgrounds really can support sustainability teams in managing those voluntary reporting requirements and making sure that teams around the company are really working in like together and ensuring reporting integrity over all of our ESG disclosures, right? Voluntary or regulated. And that really means engaging cross-functionally and implementing and formalizing processing controls, right? Throughout the business, not just at controllership and not just at sustainability.
You mentioned the need for some upskilling. How would you describe the challenges around sustainability reporting, given the fact that the regulatory landscape is still evolving? How do you manage that?
Yeah, well, controllers traditionally are called in and to step in and like help resolve issues, right? To offer guidance on like these complex accounting or reporting matters, interpret accounting and reporting matters. And that's exactly what I think ESG controllers are doing now and being asked to do with these upcoming regulations, right? And there's a number of challenges, which I'm sure you hear constantly, right? Especially given how fast paced this space is moving. And, as the regulations continue to grow and the compliance dates are getting closer, you have to stay agile to start to prepare, particularly given there is limited implementation guidance out there for all companies to look at. You know, for a company like us, there is interoperability across the various standards, but I think similar to other companies, like we're struggling to align like the processes that will support all these diverse requirements. And in many cases, I think companies are having to create multiple reporting strategies to meet the compliance with across the different jurisdictions, right? And I think we have to keep this all in perspective, right? For sustainability reporting, companies in some cases have less than 1 year from a major new reg being finalized to create the accounting policies, to establish controls, to interpret the concepts, to build capabilities, to like actually deliver an assurance ready report. And that's hard. And then on top of that, right, every company is having to invest in technology, people, education, training to be able to do that. So it's a huge challenge. There's precedents for how companies have done this in the past, right? When Sarbanes-Oxley in 2002, honestly, if you have a major acquisition or if you're a company that's gone public, very different types of changes in a business, but they're similar of having to bring the whole company together, working with internal and external experts to really collaborate so that everyone meets the final goal, which is compliance, right? And meeting those regulatory needs.
How does the SEC's decision to remove mandated Scope 3 reporting make your job easier? And maybe for those who don't know what that means, if you could give a little bit of context, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, so the SEC came out with their final climate rule earlier this year. And to a degree, it was a relief because it was less comprehensive and burdensome than the initial proposal that they had put out there, I think 2 years before. And to be honest, it does have a little bit lesser scope, depending on what's material or not, and I can get into that, than some of the other regulations that are out there, right? The corporate sustainability report, it is much more extensive, and the California requirements, if you're US and have business operations in California, kind of like, to your point, require Scope 3. The SEC, although not required, they have a lot of materiality conversations around many of the disclosures, which is definitely helpful. But it's interesting because the definition of materiality, when it becomes the conversation of Scope 3 or many of climate related components, is also not defined in the past, because it's new and it's evolving in that definition. So I think much of our work on climate related disclosures and operationalizing really is already in place. So as much as it makes it easier that the SEC doesn't require Scope 3, like we have to comply, and we want to be transparent on our Scope 3 emissions, whether that's a regulator asking or just like general key stakeholders. So, I guess it does make our job a little easier that there's, I'll say maybe more flexibility, but we're already preparing for it. So I think like many companies, maybe just doesn't add additional burden versus making it necessarily easier.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to talk about the finance and accounting pipeline. It's kind of a hot topic for us. Everyone in finance is dealing with a lack of qualified candidates and budget. How does that show up in ESG controllership?
Yeah, I mean, for every company, attracting the right talent, particularly the right finance skills to support like the multiple roles and responsibilities, particularly in ESG controllership, is really challenging, right? And of course, I'm sure also many companies like and at Mastercard, like people are your greatest asset, right? They can move mountains if they're the right people in the right structure. And so I think where for us, outside of even controllership and finance, we really start, and I see this in the quality of candidates, honestly, that I see looking to join my team, that they understand that we like invest in our employees, right? We're focused on building a workplace and culture that drives innovation. We want to collaborate, and we want individuals to be part of our team who want to grow and have opportunities. So I think it starts there. Then, of course, you add in like, to your question, like, that's all great, but we have this huge task at hand, right? And these upcoming regulations are demanding significant resources, investment time to assess and gather, build like information, disclosures. And to your point, like there's not an unlimited budget or unlimited time. Sometimes it's not actually the funds, it's just the time, right? And so I think it's really, really important as companies are building, right, is to look across the entire company, right? There are many internal functions, particularly as I think about like worldwide finance and supporting functions like an internal audit, like broader controllership and technical accounting. Even if you have operational risk teams who are their job is to assess the risks of how you operate, like you can leverage many of those teams and their internal expertise to advise as you prepare for assurance. And so like for us, we're obviously asking for investment resources and other, but we're starting with those behaviors, right? Leveraging like a framework that we already have to mature our processes. We're focused on business unit accountability, like that first line, who's the doer? You have to change and support us as we prepare for regulation. And I think you have to use all of your resources and really collaborate cross-functionally, not just adding individuals. You really have to, it's like such a collaborative big project, like to say we're going to be compliant with you name the reg. I think that's the actual critical. And it goes to like qualified staff. I have an expectation that on my team that you might be asked to join something where you're definitely not the specialist, but you might have very little knowledge on that topic. You should read about it. You should upskill yourself. You should, if you realize you don't understand it, pull that individual aside and say, hey, do you have 15 minutes? I need to, let's figure it out. So, because I want to support you, but I need to understand a little bit better, or where can I go and find resources? So I think it's on every single individual already at the company to then support the goals.
Yeah, I'm hearing from you how important collaboration is. It seems like that is kind of a additional skill that is needed in this area. That's probably equally as important as the technical skills, right?
Yes, 100%. I think it's one of the most important.
Yeah. We have a lot of listeners who are actually earlier in their careers. Obviously, a lot of FEI members are all of the members are senior level, but we also have a cohort of early career folks. And I'd love to know what advice you have for those who are looking to eventually, go into the ESG space, become an ESG controller.
Yep.
What would you tell them?
Well, like anything, if you're looking at your 3 to 5 year plan, I'd say understand what skills or relationships you need to acquire to get to that. If we're talking about ESG controller here, right? Right. If you're in controllership or finance now, you probably are developing some of those foundational skills, and you can then determine where you want to upskill yourself on the, sustainability, like actual issues or the frameworks, the upcoming regulations. If you're not in finance and you're in sustainability or any other function, right? I think you're probably looking for opportunities to understand processes, controls, what assurance means. And like we mentioned, like upskilling can happen very informally through like relationships that you have with wherever you are and whoever you're working with today. And that's how I started 5 years ago. I was interested. That looks interesting. How can I apply what I know? And how can I learn something from this new experience I'm having? And then I think to your point, exactly, like regardless of what your background is, there's such a high degree of coordination with different functions and different businesses that collaboration skills and the ability to influence across function is a key skill. And it makes me think about a recent conversation where someone used the phrase flexing your influence muscle, not your authority muscle. And I thought that and it was in a discussion like there was around finance, I think generally, but it really hit home to what like I'm trying to do every single day. And what I ask my team to do really every day, right? Like you can approach compliance work with a business owner and just say like, you have to add this control. Why? Because it's a compliance requirement, right? Or you can approach it extremely differently and create really that partnership with the business or whoever you needs to help you support and prepare for compliance. explaining to them like what these risks are, what you're looking to mitigate, and like what behaviors you're really trying to embed into what we do as a company as a whole. And I think this is the approach we're definitely taking. And, compliance is our goal. But if we don't have this relationship, we're not going to be successful in the long term if our business owners and our contributors as it relates to sustainability reporting really don't understand those underlying principles and behaviors needed to maintain compliance, right? You can do it once, but if they don't really understand this is not a check the box, right? At the end it is a little bit, but like if you can just change how you're doing things, you'll inevitably catch things before they become a problem. And that's what I think my advice would be is think not just checking your box or to-do list, but really how are you trying to influence those who can support your task at hand, so that they are actually helping you when you're not even asking them for something.
I love that, going beyond checking the box.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see the ESG controllership going in the next 5 years? Do you see it as its own specialty? Do you see it incorporated into the larger finance organization?
Yeah. I mean, we sit here today and it's a little bit hard to believe that, 3 years ago, ESG controllership, ESG controller really didn't exist even as a
Right.
term, right?
Yeah.
And so the function and how it plays out in corporate world is very early in maturity. But the way that it's evolved in the last 3 years-ish, I definitely see it continuing to evolve in the next 5+ years, right? As I think companies more broadly get a handle on the regs that they're trying to solve for, but as the ESG controllership teams also get a handle on the right data and building those processes for reporting and compliance, and then evolving to, further build and integrate into operational builds. How do you test those processes and controls? And as much as there's similarities, like we've talked about, right, with ESG controllership and any other role in corporate controllership and finance, I do believe it will continue to be a specialty. The same way finance teams have SEC reporting specialists, right? The SEC is a specific regulator with a specific set of requirements, understanding, to speak from the regulator, how you can meet that, how it's interpreted by all the stakeholders who have access to that public information. I think there's going to be that same need for, an ESG/CSRD kind of reporting specialist who understands, whatever the compliance requirement is. But for us, right, for CSRD, the European reporting standards, the jurisdictional compliance requirements that you have to comply with, right? It's not one, it is one reg, but it's not one reg, right? How do you interpret it? How do you respond? When inevitably there's adjustments or new standards that are going to come out. Like this is not like it's a one-time thing and done. There'll never be an amendment. So I think it'll continue to evolve. And I think of ESG controllership as a mini finance within, right? You have to have external facing. You also have to make sure that someone in the company is assessing management, right? How are you internally every month seeing if you're on track before you even need to report on something? Are you forecasting, not just from a dollars perspective, but from a build or a goal, goal management process? So all those similar types of processes that exist sometimes in finance or in others, I think are going to continue to grow as we connect it into this new space of ESG regulated reporting.
Well, Tarynn, that was my last question for you. I just want to thank you so much for your time and a lot of great takeaways, specifically, the collaboration across functions. It sounds like it's completely vital. And just, the idea of finding this space in finance that is challenging, of course, but dynamic and evolving, and the appeal of that, for people coming up in finance and accounting, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to be part of making something, which I think finance today is hard to do that, it's already
Right.
established. But if you want to be part of making something, this is a space where you can make your mark for sure, that it's going to exist in your company or other companies for a long time to come.
Exactly. Well, thank you again. This was wonderful.
Sure, it was my pleasure to be here with you today. Thanks for having me.